There's a clip circulating everywhere right now. A woman in a parking lot, hands shaking, trying to keep her voice steady, while explaining that she had to take her child to urgent care alone. Another woman filming herself in the cereal aisle, crying because groceries and daycare together means she can't breathe financially. Another one spiraling because her landlord won't fix a leaking pipe and she has no idea who to call next. These aren't isolated moments anymore. They're becoming a genre. Modern women hitting the wall of reality, one basic responsibility at a time. Carl Jung warned about this long before social media existed. He wrote, "People don't grow by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And today's collapse is what happens when the darkness was never faced. A modern woman can repeat every empowerment slogan, every independence mantra, every TikTok affirmation about choosing herself. But when real life shows up, without filters, without support, without someone carrying the load behind the scenes, everything she believed about herself unravels in minutes. Not because she's weak, but because she was never trained for adulthood, only for attention. You can watch the shift happen. She leaves a stable life because she's not fulfilled. She walks out of a marriage because she's not happy. She has a child with a man who was never going to stay because she didn't need him. She chooses the thrill, the chaos, the validation, the dopamine hits, and for a while it feels exciting. Then the bills land, the kid gets sick, the car breaks down, the nights get long, the loneliness hits in places she can't talk about, and suddenly the camera's on, and the tears are flowing, and everything is falling apart. Jung wrote, "The persona is a mask that feigns individuality. That mask is cracking everywhere." She built her identity on being independent, but what she called independence was really freedom from responsibility. Someone else fixed the car, someone else held the household together, someone else managed the structure, someone else absorbed the pressure, someone else handled the parts of life she never had to confront. When that someone else disappears, she meets the part of herself she never developed, and that's where the meltdown begins. You can hear it in every shaky voice. "I can't do this alone. And this is too much. Why is everything so hard?" Because adulthood isn't a feeling, it's a skill set, one she never had to build. Jung said the part of you that stays childish doesn't disappear, it just hides until life forces it out. That's what we're seeing. The child self taking the controls in an adult world. The shadow, the untrained, untested, undisciplined side of the psyche, is running the show, and the real world doesn't negotiate with it. These breakdowns aren't about the situation. They're about the sudden realization that she is face to face with a life she never prepared for. Not emotionally, not practically, not psychologically. Real life is indifferent. It doesn't slow down because someone was overprotected. It doesn't soften because someone believes they're special. It doesn't rearrange itself for comfort or convenience. It demands competence, not confidence, not empowerment slogans. Competence. And when that competence is missing, the collapse is instant and overwhelming. This is why so many modern women spin out over problems that barely register for men, not because men are superior, but because men grow up being told from childhood, if something goes wrong, you handle it. Women grew up being told, if something goes wrong, someone will help you. Now there is no someone. And the collapse is everywhere. The situations that break modern women are not catastrophic events or rare emergencies. They're the routine demands of adulthood that previous generations handled without ceremony, because they understood that life doesn't stop to ask if you're ready. It simply expects you to function whether you're tired, stressed, lonely, confused, or overwhelmed. Jung explained that when a person avoids challenge long enough, the psyche starts building an inflated image of itself, and he wrote, "Inflation is always a sign of weakness, for it means one is not strong enough to contain the demands of reality." What you're seeing all over social media is the bursting of that inflation. Take the woman who proudly proclaimed she didn't need a man because she wanted freedom, adventure, and self-discovery, only to find herself having panic attacks over basic maintenance issues in her apartment, or the pressure of being solely responsible for her kids. Nothing extraordinary happened to her, nothing tragic or unusual. She simply stepped into the adulthood she rejected when it was offered to her in a stable form, and when the burden landed, it crushed the version of herself she thought was strong but was never tested. Jung warned that when the persona, the image someone performs for others, becomes too distant from the actual self, life eventually forces a collision, and the fallout is usually emotional chaos. This is exactly why so many modern women unravel, not because the task is impossible, but because the task exposes the gap between who they believed they were and who they actually are. When the mask breaks, The emotional explosion looks dramatic, but the trigger is usually something small. A kid's cold turning into a sleepless night, a bill arriving earlier than expected, a car making a noise they don't understand, a boss asking for something that requires focus they never developed. Men watch this and feel confused because to them, these are normal parts of life. Not pleasant, not easy, but manageable. They've had to figure out problems from a young age because no one ever told them the world would bend to make their life easier. Women, on the other hand, were raised inside a narrative where difficulty was framed as unfair rather than inevitable. And now that they must deal with the same inevitable difficulty, it feels to them like the world is collapsing, even though the world is functioning exactly as it always does. One of the clearest expressions of this Jungian collapse is the emotional escalation that happens when a modern woman faces a practical problem she cannot outsource. When a man encounters a situation he can't immediately solve, he goes into problem-solving mode, not because he's naturally calm or stoic, but because he was conditioned to believe that no one is coming to save him, so his only option is to act. When a modern woman encounters a situation she can't solve, she often goes into emotional overload because she was conditioned to believe that someone should have prevented this from happening, that the burden is unfair, that the situation is somehow a violation of how life was supposed to unfold. Jung described this as the collision with the shadow, the moment when a person's undeveloped traits are exposed and they must confront the parts of themselves they avoided. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is the simple truth that adulthood requires resilience, discipline, resourcefulness, emotional regulation, and the willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes. Qualities many modern women were never required to build because someone else always absorbed the weight for them. This is why independence becomes a shock instead of a triumph. It's not that modern women lack the intelligence or capability to handle real life. Many are perfectly capable in theory. The problem is that capability without preparation turns into panic the moment pressure appears. A woman who grew up being told she should never struggle, who was shielded from difficulty by parents, teachers, relatives, boyfriends, husbands, and a society that reflexively rushes to help her, enters adulthood with the belief that struggle itself is a malfunction rather than a normal part of living. So when she experiences the daily pressures that millions endure quietly, she interprets these pressures as signs that something is deeply wrong, that life is unfair, that she's losing control, that the weight is too heavy, that she's being punished. Jung would have recognized this pattern instantly. The psyche that was never tempered by friction becomes brittle, and brittleness breaks long before strength is even tested. These breakdowns are the sound of that brittleness cracking under ordinary circumstances. Meanwhile, the men who once provided the invisible scaffolding, the practical structure, the problem-solving, the emotional steadiness, are absent either because she left or never chose them in the first place. And without that scaffolding, the life she imagined becomes unstable very quickly. Jung would say she's not collapsing from life, but from the collapse of the illusion that life would always feel manageable. The crisis isn't the task, the crisis is the confrontation with reality. The most revealing part of this collapse is what happens when children enter the picture, because parenting instantly exposes whether a person was raised to be an adult or raised to expect rescue. Jung understood this dynamic better than anyone. He wrote, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents. In today's context, it's the unlived adulthood of the mother that becomes the burden of the child. Teachers will tell you the pattern is obvious. Kids from single mother homes, especially where the father is absent, not because he abandoned them, but because she either pushed him out or chose someone who was never going to stay, arrive at school tired, hungry, emotionally overstimulated and fragile. Not because their mother doesn't care, but because she's overwhelmed by responsibilities she thought she could avoid simply by declaring independence. The missing father isn't just missing as a person, he's missing as a role, a structure, a psychological anchor that stabilizes a household. Jung believed that the psyche needs both order and energy, and in families where the mother is forced to hold both, the entire system fractures because the burden is too heavy for one person who was never prepared to carry it. The modern woman's emotional breakdowns over small tasks aren't just inconveniences, they shape her children's worldview. When she cries because the car needs repairs, the child learns that inconvenience is catastrophe. When she panics over bills, the child learns that money is chaos. When she breaks down over routines like school lunches or bedtime, the child learns that daily life is overwhelming. These children grow up believing the world is hostile and unpredictable because the adult responsible for creating stability collapses under normal pressure. Jung taught that a child internalizes the emotional environment of the caregiver, and in homes where the mother is constantly on edge, constantly overwhelmed, constantly documenting her struggles for sympathy online, the child absorbs that instability as truth. The result is a generation of boys who feel responsible for their mother's emotional well-being, and girls who learn that emotional collapse is how women cope with difficulty. This is not empowerment. This is psychological inheritance, passed down not through genetics, but through behavior. The irony is that many of these women once had the stability they now desperately need. They had partners who provided structure, consistency, discipline, and problem-solving, but they traded that stability for the pursuit of a feeling, excitement, freedom, validation, novelty, and didn't understand that stability isn't something you rediscover easily once you discard it. Jung warned that rejecting one's own structure leads to fragmentation, and fragmentation leads to chaos. In relationships, that chaos shows up as a woman who wants a man to provide everything except commitment, who wants help without partnership, who wants support without boundaries, who wants masculine investment without feminine reciprocity. You can see it in the bizarre arrangement many divorced men describe: the ex-wife who calls whenever something breaks, whenever the kids get sick, whenever the bills pile up, but refuses to rebuild the relationship because she wants the benefits of the partnership without the responsibilities of being a partner. Jung would say she is trying to outsource her shadow, pushing the unmanageable parts of her life onto someone else while maintaining the image of independence. But the psyche doesn't work like that. Every avoided responsibility returns eventually, usually stronger, usually at a worse time. What makes this dynamic harder for men is that everything they do is invisible until they stop doing it. The quiet labor of masculinity, the mechanical knowledge, the emotional steadiness, the ability to absorb stress without collapsing, is only appreciated once it disappears. Jung wrote that a person who ignores the contributions of others creates an imbalance in the psyche that leads to resentment and projection. In modern relationships, this shows up as women convinced that men were oppressive or unnecessary, only to realize later that what they called oppression was actually structure, and what they dismissed as unnecessary was the invisible foundation that made their daily life possible. Now they're discovering that independence isn't what social media sold them. Independence means no one handles the problems when you're sick, exhausted, or overwhelmed. It means the house doesn't run unless you run it. It means comfort is something you build, not something you feel. Jung believed that the psyche grows through responsibility because responsibility forces the self to expand. But when responsibility hits someone unprepared, the self doesn't expand. It collapses. The emotional theatrics amplify the collapse. Instead of solving problems, many modern women broadcast the struggle, hoping sympathy will replace competence. They interpret every inconvenience as trauma because they were never taught the difference between discomfort and danger. Jung warned that emotional inflation leads to fragility, and fragility leads to overreaction. This is why a flat tire becomes a crisis, a late fee becomes a meltdown, a bad day becomes an existential emergency. They're not reacting to the situation. They're reacting to the internal realization that they have no framework for handling it. The tragedy is that these breakdowns don't stay contained to the moment. They shape patterns, they reshape families, they redefine womanhood for the next generation. And as men watch this unfold, many simply opt out, not because they dislike women, but because they refuse to enter a relationship where they must parent the person who's supposed to be their partner. The most disturbing part of this entire pattern is how predictable the collapse has become. You can see it forming years before the first breakdown video ever hits the internet. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That is exactly what is happening here. Women make a lifetime of choices built on impulse, entitlement, and the belief that someone will always step in. And when the consequences finally arrive, they call it unfairness, bad luck, or systemic failure, instead of recognizing that the unconscious decisions they made along the way created the very life they now resent. You can watch the phases unfold in almost every story. A woman leaves stability because she equates comfort with stagnation. She convinces herself she's missing out on something bigger, something exciting, something she deserves simply for being herself. She wastes years chasing an identity instead of building a life. And by the time the reality of adulthood arrives, children needing structure, finances needing discipline, homes needing maintenance, schedules needing consistency, she discovers she never developed the internal framework required to hold everything together. Jung would say she ignored the parts of herself that needed strengthening, and now she's meeting them all at once, unprepared
and overwhelmed. The emotional fragility modern culture rewards only accelerates the fall. Instead of confronting their weaknesses, many women double down on self-pity because it brings immediate emotional reward. A crying video gets support, a breakdown story gets sympathy, a victim narrative gets validation. Jung warned that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, meaning people create dramatic emotional displays to avoid the real work of facing themselves. That is the core of what we're seeing. The breakdown becomes the shield against accountability. The meltdown becomes the excuse. The tears become the strategy. Meanwhile, the men who once provided stability either pull away or never enter the picture, because they see exactly what this requires: not partnership, not cooperation, but rescue. They know that if they step in, they're not joining a life, they're inheriting a disaster. And as men withdraw, modern women become even more overwhelmed, even more fragile, even more convinced that life is uniquely unfair to them, when the truth is much simpler. Life is fair. It's just demanding. And demand exposes who was prepared and who wasn't. The impact on children is catastrophic, and Jung would have considered it the most damaging part of the entire pattern. A child raised in chaos learns chaos as normal. A child raised by a collapsing adult becomes the emotional caretaker, the stabilizer, the one silently absorbing the instability. These children grow up prematurely adult in all the wrong ways: hypervigilant, anxious, accustomed to unpredictability, while remaining childlike in the areas where structure should have shaped them. This is the generational cost of modern dysfunction. Children becoming the psychological shock absorbers for the unresolved lives of their parents. And here's the harshest truth Jung would force us to confront. Modern women are not collapsing because real life is harder than it used to be. They're collapsing because they are softer than previous generations were allowed to be. The conveniences are endless. The support systems are everywhere. The technology removes the most demanding parts of daily life, yet stress levels, breakdowns, and emotional instability are higher than ever. Jung would say the psyche rots when it's protected from necessary struggle. Without friction, there is no resilience. Without responsibility, there is no maturity. Without accountability, there is no growth.
The women who refuse to confront this reality will continue living in cycles of breakdown and blame because they're waiting for life to get easier instead of becoming stronger. They're hoping for external solutions to internal problems. They're searching for rescue instead of doing the work Jung believed every adult must eventually do: facing the shadow, accepting reality without distortion, and building the character needed to survive it. But the women who accept this truth, the ones who stop hiding behind excuses, who stop relying on emotional theatrics, who stop outsourcing responsibility, who stop expecting sympathy to solve their life, those women transform rapidly. They grow because they finally confront the parts of themselves that needed development. They find stability because they build it instead of demanding it. They raise healthier children because they lead instead of collapsing. They attract stronger relationships because they bring strength to the table. Jung said, "What you resist not only persists, but grows." When women stop resisting adulthood, the life they've been drowning in becomes manageable, even fulfilling. For the men listening, understand this: you cannot save a woman from the consequences of her own avoidance. You cannot build a stable future with someone who collapses under minor pressure. You cannot parent an adult who refuses to grow. Choose women who handle reality, not women who broadcast struggle. Choose partners, not dependents. Choose accountability, not theatrics. Jung believed that two mature people create a container that can hold life together. Anything less becomes a burden you will carry alone. And for the women who see themselves in this and feel defensive, the message is not to shame you. The message is to wake you up. Life is not out to get you. It's simply indifferent. If you meet it with softness, it crushes you. If you meet it with strength, it expands you. If this message helped you see the patterns clearly, if it gave you something to think about, if it opened a door to a conversation people are too afraid to have, then support this work so we can keep building these discussions. Like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and check the link in the description to support the work.